Hello and welcome to the Writer's Mindset with me, Ellie Betts, and occasionally my co-host Kristina Adams when she's not being a hermit. We're currently on summer break, but we've put together some compilation episodes sharing some of our favourite clips from the last year of the podcast. This week, we're talking plotting. Thanks to our patrons for all of your support. Our patrons can listen to episodes early, suggest questions for our guests, and get access to our patron-exclusive bonus series, Healthy Habits, where we share the top tips to help you become your happiest, most productive, most creative selves. The series has helped our patrons to get more movement into their lives, solve plot problems, and find simple ways to add healthier foods into their diet. And these small changes can make a big difference to your writing. Want to find out what all the fuss is about? Head over to patreon.com/writers mindset.
So I would say when I first wrote my first book, I was sort of between a plotter and a pantser. And I wrote that first book by having one chapter very clearly in mind, a chapter that was maybe like a third of the way through the book. And I wrote it, polished it. And then I had to write the whole book leading up to that scene and the whole story leading away from it, which was a very, very inefficient way of writing a book. It took me 2.5 years to write that book. And once I left my day job, I knew that 2.5 years between books was not really going to be sustainable. And so I've become more and more of a plotter and really trying to pin down a story in a spreadsheet before I dive too deep on the details. I mean, I don't do that as strictly as I'm making it sound, but the more I can move to that end of the spectrum, then the more quickly I can write high quality books. But just crime fiction writer after crime fiction writer came on the podcast and they were like, I'm always interested to see where the story will take me. And I'm like, seriously? You're writing like a mystery and you don't know how it ends? And so I think I learned from that, not that I have to be more of a pantser, but that there are really different approaches that people can take that will end with a high quality, successful, and potentially popular book. And that you should listen to those different approaches and think about them, but you shouldn't necessarily run after them if they seem, again, incompatible with your style. It's aligning how you're approaching it with what your strengths are and what your goals are.
Yeah, it can be really hard sometimes, I think. And one of the most intimidating things I found was trying to come up with a plotting system that worked, because I didn't have anything for my first book. And I got about halfway through it and started to get a bit lost. And I'm like, well, this is going to get worse when there are 5 books in this series. And then there's a spin-off series and another spin-off series and another spin-off. I'm like, I kind of need to write all this down. So I created a spreadsheet of like everything from birthdays to when I kill off characters to when people meet and stuff, just so that I got that consistency. And how many books into the series am I now? I'm about 10 books into the universe and I'm still referring back to that spreadsheet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I found the way it plays out for me is my books are very much dependent on who knows what when. And so if I don't think through, I've had the situation where I've almost gone down a path writing as if a character knows something that if I step back and look at it, I realize they either don't know or they shouldn't know, and that it's better that they don't know or shouldn't know. And that's so much easier to do if you're playing with like a 10,000 word outline, I'll say, because, my outline isn't just bullet points. It's quite beefy. And that really paid off for me in The Falcon and the Owl, which is the 4th book, because my 3rd Ann Kinnear book, because I wrote up this beefy outline. I sent it to my editor and I said, can you just take a look at this before I start writing? And he got back to me and he said, well, I think you really have to make the bad guy badder, because at the end, I'm not really buying it. And I thought about that for a while and I talked to him and I said, I ended up saying, I don't think that person's badder. I think I picked the wrong bad guy. I think I have to rework it to make somebody else be the bad guy. And that was a lot easier to do with 10,000 words on the page than it would have been with 80,000 words on the page.
So fortunately, I do have 3 active series, and my way of working on it is a little bit different, but it's what works with me. So let's say I finish writing a book in series A, and then I write an outline immediately afterward for the next book in that series, because my head is still in that story world and it's still very natural. And I still remember what just happened in that book. And that takes me about a week to 10 days. I do about a 35-page outline. And then I know that sounds insane, but I've discovered that works really well for me. And then
it's really interesting. I was
Yeah.
talking to one of my friends the other day who's working on a second book, and she's got an outline. It's not 35 pages long, but she's started to document exactly what happens in each chapter. I'm like, my plan's a bullet point?
Yeah.
Like, if I didn't outline, I think my brain would explode. But everyone has to write in a different way. And some people, find the outlines really help them. I find my bullet points really help them. Everyone's different.
I did a bullet point type of outline for a long time, and I think that would still work for me. Definitely if I had to go back to it for any reason. I was a pantser when I started out with traditional publishing, and that worked fine for me too, until I ran into a plot hole about 2 weeks before deadline. And then I was in a panic because I'd already been paid for the book, and the book was going to be late. And I could not figure out a way around the plot hole. And I was just like, oh my gosh, and I was talking to different people, and I finally got some feedback that was going to help me get out of the plot hole. Oh, but I was like, I'm never doing that again. So I went from not outlining at all to doing sort of a bullet point method. And now I've got a template that I came up with that I use. And with my type of mysteries, it's different. So I've got, introduction of suspects and kind of what the characters look like. And then I've got the first murder, and then I've got interviews with the suspects, and I've got a second murder, interviews with the suspects. I've got transition points in between there. And then I've got like a moment of danger for the sleuth. And then I've got the wrap up. And so after I fill all of that out, and I've just gotten more verbose, because I was like, okay, well, the more I can make this run, the quicker I can make this go. So I do a book in about, I'm going to say 2.5 to 3 months now, from beginning to end, just done, which is pretty speedy with this outline. But the outline itself does take a long time. So that's part of it. And then after I finish with the outline, I'm done with that series until 3 months later. And then I start on a book from series B, which I had outlined 3 to 4 months earlier than that. And that's been a good, and I get the freshness. I get to be in a different story world, but it's not hard because it's already an established series. And then I've got another series that I write at the same time that I write both of the other series. So I know that sounds a little crazy, but it's written in first person instead of third. So it's easy enough for me not to get confused. Sounds a little crazy, but
no, I think it's really good. Do you find, like, when you go back through your outline a few months later, that you pick up on stuff that you could do differently or better, or that doesn't make sense?
Definitely. And I frequently will end up changing the murderer. At some point I'll be like, I think I like this person better. And it's pretty easy to do that, because then it's just all the red herrings turn out to be clues, and all the clues turn out to be red herrings. So if you've got everybody set up that they could have done it, then it's a pretty easy change to make.
Yeah, I remember one mystery author, I can't remember who it was, but they said that they write the book and then decide on the murderer. And then when they go back and edit it, they change who the murderer is, so that it's a massive red herring all the way through the book. And then they go back in and kind of sow the seeds throughout, so they haven't completely blindsided the reader.
It's a good way of doing it. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can't, it definitely makes a surprise, because then the writer is surprised too. That wasn't what the writer had actually planned to do. So if the author can be surprised, then the reader's going to be surprised. I've had readers go, I knew it was going to be that person. I'm like, well, that's amazing, because I didn't know it was going to be that person until the last page.
Yeah, the first time I tried to write a mystery, I planned it out in bullet points. And this is a well-known story that I tell to readers of the Writer's Cookbook and podcast listeners, so some people might be aware of the Poppy Winslow saga. And I went to my post-it notes on the eve of NaNoWriMo, and it said Poppy finds out who the murderer is. I hadn't written down who the murderer was. I didn't know what their motives were. I didn't know anything. And so as I was writing it, I think the murderer changed about 3 times, and it ended up being the main character as an unreliable narrator who'd killed this character in some versions out of self-defense and sometimes out of cold blood. And I was like, this is just such a mess. It's unbelievable. So that story has been abandoned, completely abandoned, never to be seen again.
I can understand that. But now, I mean, you can go back in and say, okay, Poppy does know, and it's going to be this person. And then you could, because it's easy enough. It's easy enough to do it.
I think I would definitely write the entire thing from scratch again on the off chance I did write that book. But I'm kind of more taking the learnings that I've got and applying it now to my fantasy, because there are elements of mystery to that. But I definitely think I have learned a lot from that mess of a book. Do you plan or outline before you sit down to write in Fictionary?
Lots of people do. I'm just not. I outline after. I do a post-draft outline because I love the experience of writing. At some point, you have to outline, I think. Like if you want to design your story, you got to outline it. And scene naming can do that. When you've got your draft written, if you haven't outlined, like me, then when you name your scenes, there's your after draft outline, and you can really think about, does it make sense and does it work in the story context? So at some point, I think there must be an outline.
That's really interesting, because you're actually the first person I've interviewed that doesn't have an outline before they start writing.
I find it really dull. Like if I have the outline, I know the story and I don't want to write it.
One of the things you mentioned in your book is something called an if-then statement. So can you explain what they are and why they're helpful?
Yes. I forget the name. There's like an official name for it. But for me, it is the cause and effect of a story. And this is a really helpful outline tool that when I'm developing a story and a plot that I use, because you can write down and you can say, well, if a character does this or thinks this or feels this way, then this is the result. And it helps you double check to make sure that whatever you have that's causing something, there is a logical effect and that they're actually linked. Because you might have something that was like, well, if Cinderella wants to meet the prince, then she has to go to the ball. Well, that's a premise. There's nothing in that statement that's going to actually help you plot or write a book. So it's like, if she wants to meet the prince, so if she wants to go to the ball, you almost like have to take some steps back. If she wants to the ball, then she's going to need a dress. Okay, well, that gives you at least a plot place. How is she going to get the dress? Okay, if she needs a dress, then she needs to figure out how to get it. So how does she get the dress? Okay, well, if she, cries really hard around a bunch of mice, then a good fairy will show up, so that kind of stuff, but those are how the if-then statements work. So if you notice that your if statement doesn't give you any path or clue of how specifically to get to your then statement, then you know that you're missing something. You're missing that obstacle, you're missing your conflict, you're missing your goal, your plot, whatever. You're missing something that, your effect is not actually being triggered by your cause. And that helps a lot with plotting. And that way you can a lot of times people have problems with plotting because they're doing too general and they're looking too much at the big picture. And if you pull down and look specifically at what needs to be done, especially externally, because a lot of times you get that, well, they want to be happy. They want to find love. They want to live happily ever after. It's like, yeah, that's great, but that's internal. That's not external. So you think that what specifically has to be done? What's the specific problem? And then with your conflict, what specifically is in the way? What is keeping them from getting that, from resolving that problem, from getting that goal? And that's just a good format to get into, because it'll help you avoid a lot of problems if you outline. Not everybody outlines. This could be a good revision tool. If you're more of a pantser and you just like to wing it, then when you're going back doing your revision, you can go through and outline your chapters and then do this if-then statement and make sure that your book is flowing the way you want it to flow. And if you run into problems, then at least you know where your weak spots are and you know exactly what to do, where to fix them.
Out of curiosity, do you outline your books?
Extensively. Yeah, no, I do a lot of outlining. I do a full editorial map. I do a scene by scene, usually like a paragraph or so per scene, sometimes more if there's a lot going on. I like to joke that I always know where I'm going, but I don't always know how I'm going to get there. Sometimes I know the direction and I just kind of figure out some of the stuff as I write the scene, because things change a little bit. Like I know here's my problem and here's where I want it to end up. We'll see what the characters do. So I kind of outline my plot, but pants my characters a little bit. I'm a little strange that way. I like to, I figure out who they are during the first draft. So I like to throw them into horrific danger and throw them into the muck and then see how they get out of it. And sometimes they surprise me, like what I expect them to do, it just turns out not doing it. And then as I, toss them into the fire and go, here, solve that problem. And then slowly I figured out who they are, and then their personalities develop. And then I can go back. And hopefully that happens early, like within the first act, and then the rest of the book is okay. And then I don't have to do quite as much revision. But sometimes it's, not until the final act that I finally realize, that's who you are. And then I have to revise like the whole book for that, or at least change, their personality and how they react to things.
Most people are familiar with the hero's journey because of Joseph Campbell. And also there's, kind of memes and images of it out there. And generally speaking, we sort of have the hero's journey, if not taught to us, at least eventually you kind of pick it up or encounter it just, if you're a sci-fi writer within the convention circuit or something like that. And so I talk about the hero's journey first because most of the time it's the one people have access to and the language to talk about. Essentially, it's basically this idea that a hero has a quest, has these sort of patterns of withdrawal and return where he goes into a liminal space. And I'm using pronouns casually, so I'll get to that in a second. But so he crosses a threshold, he retrieves a boon, he takes it back, he's presented with an award, et cetera, et cetera. You can just Google and take a look at any image of the hero's journey out there, and it'll give you the sort of circular layout of this journey. You'll be very familiar with the hero's journey because you will have encountered it in like most sort of suspense thrillers, like all the 007 movies, for example, would be hero's journeys, that kind of thing. So there's these sort of quests for autonomy in a way, the hero's journey. The hero always ends up kind of going at it alone. It's usually him against the universe. He has to prove himself, either to himself or to others, et cetera, et cetera. So it has all of these also sort of messages and narrative tropes and archetypes that are associated with it. And then there's the heroine's journey. So the first and most important thing to know is that these narratives are referred to using gendered language, but they aren't gendered. So a female or non-binary person can be a hero. And the example that I often use is the recent Wonder Woman movie. She is a very classic hero. If you've seen that movie, she undertakes all of the steps and beats of a heroic narrative. And similarly, heroines can be male identified or non-binary individuals as well. So the actual biological sex of the main character does not make a difference in which kind of narrative we're on when we're talking about these. So I just want to make that kind of clear. It's just that the language we have to refer to these two narratives was kind of dictated by Campbell back in the 60s and 70s. And so that's just how it's fallen out at this juncture. So a heroine's journey is not necessarily the opposite, but what the heroine wants and the goals that she sets for herself are just completely different from the hero. And there's no like a priori value as to one journey being better or worse than the other one. It's just, as readers and as writers, we often gravitate to one instead of the other, especially in the Western world. So a heroine's journey is, generally speaking, she has something that is taken from her, and it's usually a family network or emotional tie or bond of some kind. So the example that I use often is Persephone being taken from Demeter. So then Demeter is started on a heroine's journey because she is questing for her daughter. And that's kind of what the heroine is usually doing. The heroine is usually questing for some kind of reunion or unity or cohesion of some kind. She's looking to put something back together again that was broken, or she's looking to find something that was taken. And her journey is similar in that she has a descent, she crosses a threshold, she disguises herself usually, and then she has all of these patterns, much like the hero does. But her goal and strength is almost always in accessing information and communicating with people. So a heroine on her journey is always seeking to talk to people, to get in contact with people, to put a group together, to put a group quest together. I like to say that heroines make very good generals. They're usually really good at identifying the strengths and weaknesses in others and activating them. Heroines are very good at asking for help, and that's not a weakness, it's strength because of this personality quality where they're really good at knowing what's needed to accomplish things together. And the end of the heroine's journey is almost always a compromise of some kind that is for the good, for the greater good, for the good of mankind. In the case of like the ancient Greek myths, Demeter's compromise results in the seasons, which allow for the harvest, etc. And so that's kind of sort of the core of these two narratives.
When you're planning your own books, do you plan it really rigidly against the heroine's journey, or do you treat it kind of loosely?
I treat it very loosely, and you're absolutely right. Some of the people I've encountered, there are very kind of rule-bound characters, personalities in, I guess, on the page, but also in real life. And I do say, maybe not enough, that it is just a kind of loose chassis, the heroine's journey and the hero's journey. You don't have to go through and hit every beat. In fact, if you did, it would probably come off as like very old fashioned, whether it were the hero's or the heroine's journey. Although, like I said, Wonder Woman hit every point of the hero's journey and it felt fresh and exciting to everybody. But yeah, it isn't an outline. It is just a sort of loose set of guides, and you can activate them out of order too, which many people do. And that's always how I've done it. I've never set out to just be like, well, I got the heroine's journey, I got to hit everything. Even early on, when all I had was having once learned about it in class, I was just writing what I was writing because that's what I wanted to see out in the world, which is sort of comforting. Found family is kind of my major, I would say, theme in all of my work. And not just because that's what I feel really lucky to have found in my life, but also kind of what I wanted to read more of. And so that's what I was writing. And found family is pretty much, as long as it ends happily, is pretty much always a heroine's journey. And so I was sort of naturally activating it without really meaning to.
Yeah.
And then finally I was like writing it down and I was like, oh, right. Yeah, I do that. Oh, right. Yeah, I do that.
Yeah, I've certainly found when I read or watch stuff that adheres to formula way too rigidly, I can predict it way too much. And the only thing that keeps me going, like reading or watching it, is if I like the characters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm an outliner myself. You can see behind me my whiteboards. That's all me brainstorming and then taking that information and putting it into basically a template with the 3-act structure and all of that. I find outlining really useful in that when I then sit down to write, I'm not sat there trying to come up with the story and feeling a bit like stumped as to what to write. So I usually write with the manuscript on one screen and my outline on the other, and that has helped me immensely over the years. So, and that's something that I've developed as part of my process from like 5 years ago. So it's definitely changed over time. But not everybody is an outliner. Like I know there are plenty of people who the thought of outlining, it sort of kills their creativity, and they get a lot of joy and inspiration from the discovery through the act of writing. So yeah, it totally depends. And I think, every author needs to sort of experiment, do trial and error to see what works for them. When I was writing How to Write a Successful Series, and I had my beta reader look through it, she actually suggested having a chapter on outlining, which was my experience, but then interviewing other authors who are discovery writers. So in the book, there are 2 side-by-side chapters for each type of writer, because I am very aware that not everybody has the same process as me. And I would never say to someone, you have to outline. But I would say that the authors that I did interview for discovery writing, they had their own processes and systems to combat anything that me as an outliner sees as a potential issue. So it was really interesting talking to them to find out what their process is and how they approach a series, because again, it is this huge task and my little mind couldn't wrap around how you would do it without planning. But these incredible authors do, and they have their own processes in place to get things done. And it was really interesting talking to them. That was a very rambling answer to that question.
No, it was a great answer. Out of interest, do you have an example of one of those things where you said something that an outliner would see as a problem, but the discovery writers had a solution for?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the things would be weaving through breadcrumbs and clues in earlier books for something that's going to happen in a later book. And for me, as an outliner, if I don't know what's going to happen in that later book, how do I then put a clue in the first book to then have that really organic build up to the main event that happens later on? And what I found was that the discovery writers, while they don't outline, one of them said that he sort of not outlined as he wrote, but as he wrote, he had a wall of like Post-it notes or something similar, and he made a note of what happened in each chapter as he wrote it. So then when he came to the later book, he could look back at this, map, I suppose, of what he'd written and pick and choose elements to then bring into that later book. So it still had that, thread throughout the books that came after. And I thought that was a really interesting, really clever way of still having that foreshadowing throughout without having to know what happens 6 books in.
What was your process like before you changed teams from a pantser to a plotter?
It was messy. There was a lot of trial and error, a lot of scenes that did not need to be there. So in my first novel, had a whole subplot in it that was like 30,000 words long, and it just didn't need to be in the book at all. So I eventually cut it out. But dang, like on a first novel, writing 30,000 words takes a lot of time. So I basically wasted months of work on that stupid subplot that didn't need to be in the book. And I had some similar experience with my second book too, like just a bunch of stuff that didn't need to be in it, and so much time spent on, writing. When you know how it is, when you have a day job and you're trying to write a book on the side, it's precious that you have a couple hours here and there to work on your book. And it really chapped my ass. I had wasted so much time on stuff that I eventually ended up cutting out from those books. So it was messy.
Yeah, 30,000 words is a lot of words to lose. But I suppose the book came out much stronger for it.
It did. It was a much better book after I cut the dead weight out of it. But yeah, it hurt to do it because I was like, oh my God, that's like 5 months of work or something, like it was a lot. So it was hard. It was hard to realize that.
Would you say then that it's more stressful to spend that time doing the outline first and putting that time in before you start, or more stressful to write with no outline at all?
I think it's a lot more stressful to write with no outline personally, but I like organization in my life, I like having structure. So that's something that feels less stressful to me, to like know where I'm going with everything and know where I'm going to end up in the end for sure. Takes a good deal of the stress out of writing a book, but I do still occasionally go without an outline a little bit. We'll talk about that later. We'll get into it.
You hear a lot of people though who are pantsers who don't want to outline suggest that outlining itself takes the creativity out of writing. What would you say to someone who believes that?
Well, I think it doesn't have to. There's a lot more creativity, I think, personally, in the actual writing process than in the plotting and planning process. I mean, I find that like word choice and sentence construction and adding in sensory details and like creating the dialogue and all that is much more creative, in my opinion, than just laying out a series of causes and effects, which is ultimately what outlining is, right? It's just this happens, and so as a consequence, this happens, and then this happens because that happened, So that's really like logical to me and not surprising to lay out, a chain of events that all follow from one another. So that doesn't feel like the creative part of the process to me. To me, it's like all the unpredictable stuff in storytelling that feels creative, which is, the descriptions and the dialogue, like I said, all that other stuff that you put in when you're actually writing a chapter or a scene.
Exactly. In the book, Take Off Your Pants, you actually specify that you don't have to do every single bit to the absolute final degree, right? If you want to leave some room for creativity, you can do that. There's opportunity to do that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And my outlines are, I think people would be surprised by how loose they are, considering I wrote a book on outlining, but but they are really just the most bare bones stuff. Like I just need to know, what critical moments happen for my main character and how it leads them toward these particular, climactic scenes at the end of the book. And that's it. Like that's as deep as I go. I don't go into all the specifics of who's doing what, where in a scene and who says what, or I usually don't. If I have a really great idea while I'm in the middle of outlining for like a catchy piece of dialogue or something, I'll put that in. But most of the time it's very loose and very, it's just kind of hints. It's just like the essence of what's going to happen without getting really deep into the meat of how it happens.
What's your favorite part of Cozy Mysteries then, other than the community side of things that we've covered? What do you really enjoy about writing them?
I like putting in red herrings and twists and surprises. Sometimes quite often I surprise myself as well, because I'll plan a particular plot and outline, and then when I'm partway through writing, I'm thinking, no, that's not what happens. This is what happens. Or I'll have a character, Billy, the old boy in the coffee shop in the tea room. He was only meant to be in like one scene, and he just started taking over, and now he's a favourite character who appears very often in all of the novels. He's got in some more of a main part than others, but he is always there. He's quite a useful foil to other things that are going on, and his wry comments, he's a useful vehicle for comedy as well. But I didn't plan him. He just arrived, and started heckling, really. and it's those surprises that are part of the magic, and it's when something takes over that you weren't expecting. And it must have been, mulling away in your subconscious. So you have at some point made a decision about it, but it's when those things actually come to light and you realise things that you hadn't planned are starting to happen. And that, to me, is the most exciting part.
You mentioned just then about outlining. So I'm curious, what's your planning process like? How in depth are your outlines? And do you kind of treat them as very rigid, or do you see them as kind of like a guide, but if something goes off on a wild tangent, you're going to go with the tangent?
Yeah, exactly that. I started with my first few books. I had a very, very, very outlined plan. So there might be a sentence per chapter to have the basic structure of the plot. I write in short chapters. My books are relatively short. The right length for their genre, about 50 to 60,000 words. Chapters are about 1,500 words each, and each chapter is a little episode. And so that kind of plotting, where you say, well, this happens in this chapter, this happens in this chapter, that is a perfectly fine way to plot. As I've gone forward, I've actually started plotting in a little bit more detail. So this, for example, is a page that I've just been writing up from my current book. So you can see there's a couple of paragraphs for each chapter. And then before I write that chapter, and sometimes a little bit in advance, I scribble on extra details. You can see different notes have been added on there. And where I think, oh yes, well, that needs to go in there as well, that detail, or that needs to change or something. And then before I sit down to write each chapter, and sometimes the night before, I will write, this is my next notebook. So then here, for example, this is fleshing out the paragraph, sort of building on the couple of paragraphs there. So that's about a page and a half of notes. And then I sit down to write it. A chapter will be about the equivalent of 6 or 7 pages of that size. I'll write by hand. So it'll be about 6 or 7 pages, which will come out to sort of 12, 14, 1,500 words. My outlining will change as I go along. So originally there were going to be 25 chapters in this book. This morning I wrote chapter 29. There are about 6 or 7 more chapters to come. So it's sort of embryonic. It evolves as I'm writing it. And so I write by hand, and then I type it up. At the moment, my daughter, who's on her gap year, she's typing it up for me, which is wonderful. And then when I get to so this is the first draft of a typed script. And you can see I've got scribbles all over the place where I'm changing the language, getting rid of superfluous words, adding in some details sometimes. Sometimes I'll add in quite a lot of detail. So for that page, having changed that much already, that is a little bit to go into where the asterisk was marked. So it does change quite substantially at TypeScript stage. And then I'll probably go over it through the whole thing, about another 4 or 5 times, making successively fewer edits until it's got to the point where it needs to be seen by somebody else. And then it goes off to my editor.
If you found this compilation interesting or helpful, make sure you subscribe to The Writer's Mindset on YouTube or on your favourite podcast platform, or all of them if you're feeling generous. Everything from a like to a rating to a review to a subscribe to shouting about us on social media helps us to reach more writers so that they can overcome their mindset issues that are holding them back from their writing too. Have a great summer, and we'll see you soon. Keep writing.